The kettle was screaming and I couldn't move. That's the part nobody believes when I tell this story. Not the betrayal, not the lawyers, not the dinner. They believe all of that. What they don't believe is that a woman can stand in her own kitchen, in a house she paid for with her mother's life savings, holding a phone against her ear while the kettle shrieks 18 inches from her hand, and simply not be able to lift her arm to turn it off. The voice on the other end belonged to a 74-year-old man I had met exactly twice. He said my name the way doctors say a name before they tell you something. Mrs. Whitmore, there's a microphone still active in your kitchen. It's been recording since the day you moved in, and it's still linked to my account, and I have listened to 4 minutes of it, and I need you to come here, today, alone. I said, I'm sorry, what? And he said, don't tell your husband. Behind me, in the next room, Daniel was laughing at something his mother had said, that easy, unbothered laugh of his. I'd heard it at our wedding and at my mother's funeral and across 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays, and it had always sounded like safety to me. The kettle kept screaming. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 41 years old. I have spent 18 years as a nurse in a cardiac ICU, which means I have spent 18 years reading the small signs of decline in people who insist they feel fine. A number drifting, a rhythm going soft, a patient who says nothing hurts while the monitor above their head quietly disagrees. I could read a stranger's body like a page. I could not read the 2 people sleeping under my roof. My mother ran a bakery for 34 years. Callahan's on 3rd, with the crooked awning she refused to replace because she said the tilt kept the rain off the door. She was up at 3:40 every morning of my childhood. She had burn scars on both forearms shaped like commas. When she finally sold the building at 72, the man who bought it kept her name on the glass, which made her cry in the parking lot and then insist she'd been cutting onions. She died 11 months later. What she left me was not a fortune. It was $260,000 and a rolling pin worn concave in the middle from her palms. I did not touch the money for 2 years. I couldn't. It sat in an account, and I would look at the balance sometimes late at night the way you look at a photograph, and then I would close the app. Then the house came up on Delaney Street. It was a 1926 Craftsman with deep eaves and a porch that ran the whole front, and a stained glass panel above the door that threw green light onto the floorboards every afternoon around 4. Original built-ins. A kitchen window over the sink facing east, which meant morning light while you washed dishes, which was the only thing my mother ever said she wanted in a house and never had. I put down $240,000. My savings covered the closing costs. Daniel put in nothing, and I want to be careful here, because I didn't resent that at the time. His restaurant had closed 14 months earlier. He was rebuilding. He was regional sales for a medical device company, and he was good at it, and he told me he'd catch up, and I believed him, because I loved him, and because catching up is what people do. I signed the papers alone on a Thursday because Daniel had a conference in Cleveland. The closing attorney slid the deed across the table, and my hand shook so hard I had to sign twice. Sole owner. My name, all 4 syllables, in blue ink. I remember thinking, Mom, I got you the window. Daniel came home Friday, and we ate takeout on the floor of the empty living room, and he kissed my forehead and said, we did it. And I let him say we, because that's what marriage is supposed to be. A place where the pronouns blur. His mother arrived Saturday. Vivian Whitmore is 71 and has never once in her life raised her voice, which is a thing people say about her like it's a compliment. She doesn't need to. She has a way of stating her preferences in the past tense, as though they've already happened. We put the sofa there. We're doing white on the trim. She walked into my house that first weekend, set her handbag on my kitchen island, turned in a slow circle and said, well, this will do. Not it's beautiful, not congratulations, this will do. I laughed about it that night. I actually laughed. I told Daniel, and he rolled his eyes and said, that's just Mom. And I said, I know. And I fell asleep with my hand on his chest, feeling the steady, ordinary drum of a heart I thought I understood. 7 days later, Harold Vance called me. I'd met Harold twice, once at the walkthrough, once at closing. Both times he'd worn a pressed shirt buttoned to the throat, and both times he'd apologized for something that wasn't his fault. The state of the basement, the sticking window in the back bedroom. He'd been a mechanic for a regional airline for 41 years, hands scarred and enormous, and he'd lived in that house with his wife Rosalind for 38 of them. She'd died 2 years before the sale. He'd told me that at the walkthrough while looking at the kitchen window, and then he'd cleared his throat and moved on to talk about the water heater. At closing, he'd shaken my hand and held it a half-second too long and said, "It's a good house. It'll tell you the truth about itself if you listen." I thought it was just something old men say. Tuesday afternoon, day 7. Boxes in the hall. Paint fumes. Vivian had come by with a fabric swatch book, and Daniel was up on a stepladder hanging his parents' wedding portrait above the mantel, and my phone rang with a number I didn't know. I almost didn't answer. "I want you to sit with that." I almost didn't answer. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's Harold Vance." "Harold, hi, is everything—" "I owe you an apology, and I'm going to make it a short one, because there's a longer conversation we need to have, and I'd rather have it face to face." Something in my chest went tight. I stepped into the pantry and pulled the door most of the way shut. He explained it in the flat, methodical way of a man who'd spent his life explaining mechanical failures. In 2016, he'd installed a home system. Not cameras, he said. Rosalind hated cameras. An intercom. Wall panels in the kitchen, the front hall, the upstairs landing, so she could reach him in the garage when her hip got bad and she couldn't manage the stairs. The panels had microphones. The system logged audio to his account whenever it detected voices in a room, and it kept the clips for 90 days. Before the sale, he'd pulled 3 panels off the wall. The kitchen one was recessed into the cabinetry beside the pantry door, wired behind the trim, and he'd forgotten it existed the way you forget a light switch in a room you never use. "My storage filled up," he said. "That's the only reason I looked. I went in to delete it all, and there was a clip flagged from Sunday, and I only meant to check it wasn't the 2 of us I'd recorded by accident, and I'm 74 years old, Mrs. Whitmore, and I have never eavesdropped on a soul in my life." Harold! 4 minutes. That's all I listened to. Then I stopped and I sat down and I made a copy, and I have been arguing with myself for 2 days about whether to call you. The pantry smelled like the cinnamon I'd unpacked that morning. Through the crack in the door, I could see Daniel's shoulder, the sleeve of his gray sweater, the way he leaned to take the swatch book from his mother's hand. "What's on it?" I said. "Come here, today, if you can." "Harold, tell me what's on it." There was a long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something careful and almost tender, and that frightened me more than anything he'd said. "Your husband and his mother, talking about you." I closed my eyes. "Come alone," he said. "Please, and don't tell him you're coming." I hung up. I stood in that pantry for maybe 40 seconds with my hand pressed flat against the shelf, and I did the thing I've done at the bedside of 1,000 patients when the numbers first start going wrong. I counted my own pulse. 96. Too fast, and I made myself breathe until it wasn't. Then I opened the door and walked out and said, in a voice I did not recognize as mine because it was so perfectly, horribly normal, "I'm going to run out for more painter's tape. We're almost out." Daniel didn't look down from the ladder. "Grab the blue kind." Vivian looked at me. She looked at me for about 2 seconds longer than a person needs to, the way she always did, like she was checking a figure against a column. "Take your time, dear," she said. I did. Harold's apartment was in one of those low brick buildings for people over 55, with a courtyard nobody sits in. He opened the door before I knocked. There was a plate of cookies on the table, store-bought, arranged carefully. That detail undid me a little. This man had thought, "She's going to have a terrible afternoon. I should put out cookies." He'd set up a laptop and a small speaker. His hands weren't steady on the trackpad. "I want to say 2 things first," he said. 1. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I don't know your family. 2. If you tell me to close this and delete it, I'll close it and delete it, and you'll never hear from me again. Play it. He hesitated. "It's audio only. You'll hear the kitchen. There's a hum on it. That's your refrigerator." "Harold, play it." He pressed the key. The first thing I heard was my own refrigerator. That's a strange thing, to hear your own appliance from a stranger's laptop. Then a chair scraping, then Vivian, close to the panel, her voice as clear as if she were standing in the room with us. "She signed it alone. That's what I don't like. Sole title. Not even a survivorship clause. Daniel further away, overrunning water. She was going to anyway, Mom. The money's hers. There wasn't a version where my name went on it. There was, if you'd been paid attention. Don't. Silence. Water shutting off. Then Vivian again, and her tone changed. Warmer. Almost fond. That was the worst of it, if I'm honest. Not the words. The warmth. Danny, Gerald says the cleanest way is the trust. You put the house into the family trust for estate purposes, everybody's protected, and it looks like exactly what it is on paper, which is estate planning. It's not a lie. It's a sequence. She reads things. She reads the first page. She reads what you hand her while you're standing there being patient with her. There's a difference between reading and being read to. And Daniel laughed. Not cruelly. That's what I keep coming back to. He laughed the way you laugh when your mother says something true about someone you love a little condescendingly. An affectionate laugh. A laugh that said, "Yeah, that's Claire." She trusts me with all of it, he said. She had me handle the whole closing binder. She didn't even open the folder. Then don't waste it, sweetheart. That kind of trust doesn't renew. There was a pause, ice into a glass, and then Daniel said the sentence. Halyard's going to come due in the spring. Neil's already talking to a lawyer. If the house is in the trust before that happens, it's not an asset they can look at. And Vivian said, "That's why we're doing it now." And then, and I have replayed this 1,000 times, and it never gets easier, Daniel said, "I'm not stealing from her, Mom. She just doesn't have to carry it." Harold reached over and stopped the playback. His jaw was working. "There's more," he said quietly. Another 11 minutes across 2 clips. I didn't listen to those. I skipped through to check the dates. I sat very still. I want to tell you that I cried, or shouted, or swept the cookies off the table. I didn't do any of it. Something happened in me that I have felt exactly twice before. Both times at 3 a.m. in a hospital. Both times when a patient I had been talking to an hour earlier stopped having a heartbeat. Everything went quiet and very, very clear. Halyard, the restaurant. It closed 14 months ago, and Daniel told me the investors had been made whole. He told me that in the car on the way back from the closing. He said it in that light, dismissive way he says things that are finished, all squared up. Neil Ostrowski had put in $90,000. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Harold said. "How much is on there in total? Everything the system has." 90 days rolling, but it only records when it hears voices in that room. Maybe 6 hours of clips. "Can you copy all of it?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he got up, went to a drawer, and came back with a flash drive still in its packaging, which he'd clearly bought for this. "Already did," he said. "I made 2. One's in an envelope with my lawyer. Old habit. I spent 40 years documenting engine faults for men who'd rather I hadn't. I took it. It weighed nothing. A small gray rectangle, lighter than a house key. At the door he stopped me. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I say one thing that isn't my business? Please." Rosalind was sick for 6 years. Toward the end I handled everything for her. Bills, insurance, the lot. And every single month I sat down at that kitchen table and I read the numbers out loud to her whether she was awake or not. He looked at his hands. Handling a thing for someone and hiding a thing from someone use the same muscles. You can tell the difference by whether they ever have to find out. I got in my car and drove 2 blocks and pulled over and put my forehead on the steering wheel. Then I sat up, wiped my face, drove to the hardware store, and bought a roll of blue painter's tape. Because I was going to need it, and because a woman who comes home empty-handed has already told her husband something. Here is what 18 years in an ICU teaches you. You do not react to the first bad number. You get more numbers. You do not tell the patient's family what you suspect until you can show them. You do not accuse a colleague of a med error until you've pulled the chart. You watch, you document, you stay unbelievably calm, and you write everything down with the time next to it. Because when it all falls apart later, the only thing that will stand up is the record. I walked back into my house at 6:15 with painter's tape in my hand, and I became the best nurse I have ever been. "Get the blue?" Daniel called. "Got the blue." He came into the kitchen and kissed my temple, and I let him, and I watched myself let him from somewhere near the ceiling. He smelled like the sawdust of the shelf he'd been sanding. He was happy. That's the thing that took me weeks to make peace with. He wasn't performing happiness. He was happy, standing in a house he intended to take from me, and he saw no contradiction in it at all. Vivian had gone home. On the counter, where she'd left it, was the fabric swatch book, and beneath it, a business card I hadn't noticed before. Curtis Lyle, Mortgage and Lending Solutions. Handwritten on the back, in Vivian's small, tidy capitals, Wednesday 2 p.m. Bring the trust doc. I looked at it for 4 seconds. I did not pick it up. I took my phone out and photographed it where it lay, from above, without moving it a millimeter, and then I put the phone in my back pocket and I asked Daniel what he wanted for dinner. That night I lay awake next to him and made a list in my head. 1. Find out what document exists and what it actually does. 2. Find out what Halyard really owes and to whom. 3. Find a lawyer who has never met anyone I know. 4. Do not change a single thing about how I behave. 4 was the hardest. 4 was the one that nearly killed me. For the next 19 days, I made his coffee. I laughed at his stories. I rubbed his shoulders while he complained about a client in Dayton. I said I love you every night, and here's the thing I've never admitted out loud until now. It wasn't always a lie. Some nights it came out of me before I could stop it. You cannot love someone for 11 years and then not love them because you've learned something on a Tuesday. Grief doesn't work on a schedule, and neither does the heart. I hated myself for those nights. I kept going anyway. I started small. The closing binder he'd handled was in the office closet. I photographed all 61 pages one evening while he was at the gym, put it back with the corner aligned to the shelf edge exactly as I'd found it, and emailed the images to an account I'd made under my mother's maiden name. I bought a voice recorder, not an app. An actual little device, $42, because apps can be seen. It lived in the pocket of my gray cardigan, the shapeless one Vivian had once called comfortable in a tone that meant something else. I wore that cardigan for 3 straight weeks. I opened a separate bank account at a credit union in a town where I have no history, and I started listening to my own life the way you listen to a patient's chest. Once you know, you cannot unhear it. Vivian arriving 4 afternoons a week, always around 3:30, always 15 minutes before the mail. Daniel intercepting every envelope from the county, the lender, the title company, sorting them at the counter with his back to the room. Just junk, just the escrow stuff. I'll deal with it. The way conversation didn't stop when I entered a room but bent, gently, the way a river bends around a stone that's always been there. And Vivian, walking my hallway with a tape measure, standing in my dining room saying, once this wall comes down, opening my mother's pantry and rearranging the shelves, and when I came in, smiling at me with real affection and saying, I hope you don't mind, I've done this kitchen in my head for 30 years. She hadn't lived there 30 years. She'd wanted to. The document came home on a Thursday. Daniel set a folder on the dining table with the casualness of a man setting down keys. Vivian was there, of course. She'd made a pot roast in my kitchen. She'd used my mother's Dutch oven. Boring stuff, he said. Estate planning. Gerald put it together as a favor. Gerald Poole. Vivian's cousin, 70, an estate attorney in the next county who once told me at a Christmas party that nursing was a lovely thing for a woman to fall back on. Every family should have a trust, Vivian said, spooning carrots onto my plate. It keeps everything out of probate. My father didn't have one, and it took us 2 years to unwind it. 2 years, Claire. That sounds awful, I said. It was. She patted my wrist. You sign, Danny signs, we file it, and none of us ever thinks about it again. You won't even have to think about it again. Almost the words from the recording. Almost, but not quite. And hearing the family phrase come out of her mouth in real time was like watching a rehearsal you'd been handed the script for. I'd love to read it properly, I said. You know how I am. I read the discharge instructions for other people's grandmothers. There it was, just for a moment. A flicker at the corner of Daniel's mouth, the smallest tightening, the same thing I've seen 100 times on the face of a patient who's just been told the scan came back and we need to talk. Course, he said. No rush at all. But there was a rush. Curtis Lyle had a Wednesday appointment. I read that document for 6 nights, at the kitchen table, between 1 and 3 in the morning, with the laptop brightness at its lowest setting and my mother's rolling pin sitting next to me on the table because I found that I liked having it there. It was 41 pages. Most of it was exactly what they said it was. The Whitmore Family Revocable Trust, successor trustees, distribution schedules, boilerplate about incapacity, perfectly ordinary, perfectly boring. Designed, I came to understand, to be boring for 8 pages. Page 9, Schedule A, property to be transferred into trust. And there it was, the legal description of the house on Delaney Street, the parcel number, the words conveyed in full. And then, on page 9, paragraph 4, grantor's contribution of separate property to the trust shall be deemed a gift to the community and shall not retain its separate character upon transfer. I read it 4 times before I understood. My mother's bakery, 34 years of 3:40 in the morning, $240,000. That sentence took the word mine off of it and replaced it with the word ours, and then a second document, the one I found clipped behind Schedule A, made Daniel and Vivian co-trustees, and a third clause on page 22 gave the trustees authority to encumber trust property by majority vote. 2 trustees against 1, a mother and her son. They could borrow against my house, both of them, voting together, without me. And the reason for the hurry was sitting in a spring court date with Neil Ostrowski's name on it. Because a house you own is an asset a creditor can look at. A house held in a family trust, transferred more than a year before a judgment, gets a great deal harder to touch. I wasn't the target. That's what I want people to understand. I was the safe. I sat in the dark with my hand on the rolling pin, and I thought about my mother, who came home one December with her hands cracked open from the cold and the flour, and who told me, when I cried about it, that the trick to being taken advantage of is that it always feels like being taken care of first. I didn't cry that night either. The next morning, I asked Daniel, over coffee, in a voice like sunshine, what page 9 meant, because I hadn't understood the part about separate property. And my husband looked at me with love in his eyes and said, honestly, it's just a formality. Gerald says it's in every one of these. That was the moment. Not the recording, not the clause. The moment he lied to my face in the morning light, gently, kindly, while pouring me a cup of coffee. I said, oh, okay. And I smiled at him. And somewhere under the gray cardigan, the little recorder ran. I found her the way you find anything when you're afraid, at 2 a.m, on a phone, under a blanket, with the screen turned all the way down so the light wouldn't reach the man breathing beside me. Loretta Shaw, 31 years, real property and elder financial exploitation. Her website was ugly. That's what sold me. It looked like it had been built in 2009 and never touched, because she had better things to do. Her office was above an insurance agency and smelled like burnt coffee. She was maybe 65, silver haircut like she trimmed it herself, reading glasses shoved up into it and a second pair on her desk. She let me talk for 11 minutes without saying a word. Then she said, "Play me the audio." She listened to the whole thing, all 6 hours, over 2 appointments, taking notes on a legal pad with a pen she clicked whenever something interested her. Click, click, click. When it was done, she took off the reading glasses. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to be blunt because I think you'd find gentleness insulting at this point. Please. None of this is a crime yet." I felt the floor go. "Not yet," she said. "Listen. There's nothing illegal about a husband asking his wife to sign a trust document. There's nothing illegal about a mother-in-law making an appointment with a mortgage broker. If you sign that document and you're an adult of sound mind and you had the opportunity to read it, then in the eyes of the law you agreed to it. Fraud is very hard to prove when the victim signs. That's not a flaw in the system. That's the system. The signature is the whole thing." She tapped page 9. "This is well drafted. Whoever wrote this knew exactly what they were doing, which tells me your cousin Gerald is either very good or has done it before. It's built to be signed by a woman who loves the man holding the pen. So what do I do?" And Loretta Shaw smiled for the first time, and I understood why she had 31 years. "You don't sign it. That's the boring answer, and it's the true one. But it's not enough, is it? Because if you refuse, they wait. They soften you. They try again in 8 months, with a nicer version, when you're tired or sick, or when he's been especially good to you. Refusing protects the house for a season. It doesn't protect you. She started writing. So here's what we do instead. 3 things. First, I record a declaration of homestead and a notice of sole ownership interest with the county tomorrow morning. Public record. It puts every lender in this state on notice that this property is separate property held by you alone. Second, we don't leave the deed lying around like a coat on a chair. I transfer title into a trust of your making, with an independent professional trustee, and you as sole beneficiary and sole director. It costs you $1,100, and it means no signature, not yours under pressure, not anyone's, moves that house without a written instruction verified by a trustee who has never met your husband and has a fiduciary duty to ignore him. Third, and this is the one that matters, we send a preservation letter to Curtis Lyle and to Gerald Poole. Nothing dramatic. It just says, my client is the sole owner. She has not authorized any conveyance. Retain all your records regarding this property. 2 paragraphs. It will land like a brick. When? After. Not before. She looked at me over the top of the glasses. Mrs. Whitmore, your husband and his mother are currently very relaxed. Relaxed people say things. I would like them to keep saying things for another 2 weeks. I felt something in my chest that was not quite hope. There's one more thing, I said, and I slid a page across her desk. I'd printed it from the county civil docket at 2 a.m. Ostrowski et al. Versus Halyard Hospitality, LLC, and Daniel R. Whitmore, individually, filed in March, personally named. $186,000. He had never told me, not once. There was a lawsuit with my husband's name on it, and he had come home every night for 4 months and asked me how my shift was. Loretta read it. She put the page down. She was quiet. That changes something, she said. It makes it worse. It makes it documented. Click went the pen. That's a motive with a date on it. Now, can you keep doing what you've been doing for 14 more days? I thought about the coffee, the kiss on the temple, the pot roast in my mother's Dutch oven. I'm a nurse, I said. I have told people their husband is dying and then asked them if they wanted a cup of tea. I can smile. Nothing makes a man careless like getting his way. I stopped asking questions about page 9. I mentioned offhand over pasta that Vivian was probably right about probate. I said I'd been silly to make a fuss. I asked Daniel whether the guest room should be blue or that greenish gray, and he lit up like I'd handed him something, and Vivian squeezed my hand across the table and said, "There she is." The change in them was immediate, and it was obscene. Daniel started talking about the basement. He wanted an office down there. He wanted a wet bar, actually, for when Neil and the guys came around, and I noted the name and said nothing. He talked about a place on a lake someday, once things are more flexible. He said the word equity twice in 1 week to a woman he believed had never read a term sheet in her life. Vivian brought a contractor to my house on a Saturday morning. Did not tell me he was coming. I came downstairs in my robe, and there was a man with a clipboard in my dining room, and my mother-in-law saying, "This wall is not load-bearing. We've had it checked." We've had it checked. I made them both coffee. Wednesday afternoon, Vivian took a phone call in my back garden. She stood by the hydrangeas with her back to the house, and I stood at the kitchen window over the sink, in the morning light my mother never got, with the window cracked 2 inches for the paint fumes. She said, "Curtis, once it's in the trust, the appraisal is the only question. She's not going to be on the phone with you. She won't be on any of the calls." And then she laughed at something he said, and she said the sentence I gave to Loretta Shaw the next morning, and which Loretta played twice, once for me and once, later, for Daniel. She's the nicest girl in the world, and she has absolutely no idea what she owns. I stood at that window with a wet plate in my hands. I want to tell you about the nights, because people always skip the nights. I would lie beside him in the dark and listen to him breathe, and I would think about the man who drove 4 hours through an ice storm to get to my mother's funeral because I'd said on the phone, badly, that I didn't want to walk in alone. That man was real. He held my hand at the graveside, and he didn't say a single stupid, comforting thing, which is the rarest kindness there is. He was real. And so was the man on Harold Vance's laptop, laughing. Both of them were sleeping next to me. That's the thing nobody prepares you for. It isn't that you discover your husband is a stranger. It's that he isn't. He's exactly who you thought, plus something else. And the something else was always in the room. I lost 9 pounds in 3 weeks. I told him it was the new shift rotation. On the 11th day, Vivian mentioned that she knew a notary, Bev Tandy, from her church. So much easier than dragging you out to an office, dear, after your long shifts. Bev could come to the house. Bev could come Friday with dinner, and we could make an evening of it. I let a silence sit. I let my hand pause on my wine glass, the way a woman pauses when she's letting go of the last of something. Then I smiled and said, "Friday's good. Let's make it nice." Vivian's face. I will keep that expression for the rest of my life in a small box and take it out when I need it. Pure, uncomplicated triumph. And underneath it, something almost like tenderness, because in her own way, in the only way she had, she was welcoming me into the family. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, and I thought about a small gray flash drive and a homestead declaration recorded at 9:04 on a Tuesday morning, and an independent trustee named Margaret Ruiz, who had never met my husband and never would. He set the table with the good china. Our wedding china, still in its tissue paper, 11 years later. Candles. A bottle of wine he'd clearly bought at the place downtown he pretends is too expensive. Vivian came in a blue dress with her hair set. Bev Tandy the notary arrived at 7 with a canvas tote and an embosser and the flustered good cheer of a woman who thought she was doing a small favor for a friend. I want to be very precise about how I felt, because I've been asked about it a lot. I was not nervous. My hands were steady. In the ICU, there is a moment when everything is going wrong, when the room gets loud and then, if you're any good, it goes quiet. You stop hearing the alarms. You see the chest and the line and the drug and the order, and your voice comes out flat and slow. That's where I was, over the pot roast. Vivian told the story about Daniel at 9 years old, selling firewood door to door in the snow. She'd told it at our wedding. It's a story about a boy who understands the value of $1, and I had always heard it as charming, and that night I heard what it actually was, which was a woman explaining her son to me for 11 years, and me not listening. Daniel poured the last of the wine and stood up and said, "To this house." "To this house," I said. Bev laid out her stamp. Daniel took the folder from the sideboard, opened it to the signature page, smoothed it flat with the side of his hand, and slid the pen across the tablecloth toward me. "No rush," he said. He'd said that before, and it had never once been true. I picked up the pen. I felt the weight of it. Vivian leaned forward maybe 2 inches, her wine forgotten, and Bev Tandy uncapped her stamp, and Daniel watched my hand. And I set the pen down on the tablecloth, uncapped, beside the plate. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I'd like to introduce you to someone." The doorbell rang. Nobody moved. I stood up, walked down my own hallway, past the stained glass that had gone dark hours ago, and opened the door. Loretta Shaw was in a brown suit and flat shoes, holding a soft leather folder against her hip like a woman carrying groceries. Behind her, at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in his hands, stood Harold Vance. "Good evening," Loretta said. "Sorry to interrupt dinner." I stood aside and let them in. What I remember most is the sound of Daniel's chair. It went over backwards and hit the floorboards and nobody picked it up. It stayed there the whole time, on its back, its 4 legs in the air, while the candles burned down. "Claire," he said. "What is this?" Loretta set her folder on the table beside the wine. "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Loretta Shaw. I represent Claire Whitmore in matters relating to this property." She turned, without hurrying, to the notary. "Ms. Tandy, I want you to understand you've done nothing wrong, but I'd like you to look at something before you stamp anything tonight." Bev Tandy put her stamp down like it had gotten hot. Loretta laid out the pages, one at a time, and she never raised her voice, not once. The recorded declaration of homestead, county stamp in the corner, dated 18 days earlier. The certificate of title showing the property held in the Callahan Trust, Margaret Ruiz, independent trustee, Claire Whitmore, sole beneficiary and sole director. The preservation letters, delivered by certified mail, signed for by Curtis Lyle's office at 10:22 a.m. and by Gerald Poole's paralegal at 11:40. Any conveyance, encumbrance, or refinancing of this property requires the written instruction of the beneficiary, verified independently by the trustee, with separate counsel present, Loretta said. No signature obtained at this table, tonight or on any other night, can move this house. The document in front of you is, at this moment, a piece of paper. Vivian's face had not changed. I'll give her that. She was calculating. You could watch her run the numbers, looking for the door. This is a family matter, she said, and it's been badly misunderstood. We were doing estate planning. There's nothing improper about— Page 9, paragraph 4, Loretta said. Vivian stopped. Page 22, encumbrance by majority vote of the trustees. 2 trustees, both of them named Whitmore. She let it sit. And Ostrowski versus Halyard Hospitality and Daniel Whitmore individually filed the 11th of March, $186,000, first hearing in April. Daniel made a small sound. I looked at him. I made myself do it properly, the way I'd once looked at a monitor and understood, before anyone else in the room, that we were going to lose him. You never told me about the lawsuit, I said. Claire, 4 months. You asked me about my shifts. I was going to fix it before you ever had to, with my mother's house. And then Loretta reached into the folder and took out the little recorder, and she set it in the middle of the wedding china, and she pressed the button. My kitchen, my refrigerator humming, and my husband's voice, warm, easy, the voice that had said I do, and she'd have loved this and sleep. I'll get it. I'm not stealing from her, Mom. She just doesn't have to carry it. And then Vivian, in the garden, laughing. She's the nicest girl in the world, and she has absolutely no idea what she owns. Bev Tandy stood up, quietly, gathered her tote and her stamp, said, I think I'll go, to nobody, and left. I never saw her again. I hope she's well. Daniel had gone the color of the tablecloth. How long, he said, how long have you known? And I thought about telling him, 31 days, since a kettle screamed in my kitchen and a stranger was kinder to me than my husband had been in a year, since I stood in a pantry and counted my own pulse. Long enough, I said. He looked past me, then, at the man standing quietly by the door with his hat in his hands, and I watched him understand. You, he said. Harold Vance didn't say anything for a moment. Then, in the exact flat tone he'd used telling me about the water heater, I built that intercom so my wife could call me when she couldn't get down the stairs. 38 years, that panel never heard anything worse than her asking me to bring up the good scissors. He looked around at the dining room, at the overturned chair, at the burning candles. 7 days you two lasted. 7 days in a house I loved. He put his hat on. I'll wait in the car, Mrs. Whitmore. Take as long as you need. They were gone in 90 minutes. Daniel packed 2 bags. He moved through the bedroom we'd shared for 5 weeks with a terrible carefulness, folding things, and at one point he stood holding a shirt and didn't move for so long that I had to look away. At the door he tried once. Claire, I have never once in 11 years wanted anything from you that wasn't— Don't, I said it quietly. Don't finish that, because I'll believe it and I can't afford to. That's the truest thing I said all night. Vivian waited on the porch with her handbag over her arm and her chin up, and as I closed the door, she turned and said, in the same warm tone she'd used to spoon carrots onto my plate, You've just made yourself very alone, dear. Family is the only thing that catches you. And I said, My family got up at 3:40 in the morning for 34 years so I'd have something worth stealing. You just didn't like that she left it to me. I shut the door. Then I went back into my dining room and I set Daniel's chair upright because I couldn't stand to look at it, and I blew out the candles one at a time, and I sat down at the head of my own table in a room that smelled like pot roast and hot wax, and I cried for about 40 minutes. Not for the marriage. That's what surprised me. I cried because I had loved him honestly, and being honest had not been a mistake, and I was going to have to spend a long time convincing myself of that. The divorce took 11 months. It was ugly in the small ways rather than the large ones, because there was nothing to fight about. The house had never been community property, and after Loretta's filings, it never could be. Gerald Poole retired abruptly and stopped answering letters. Curtis Lyle's firm sent a 2-line note stating that they had no active file. Neil Ostrowski's suit settled in the fall for an amount I never asked about, and Daniel is paying it monthly, which he could have told me in March, and which I would have helped him with, and I think about that more than anything. He could have just asked me. That's the whole thing. That's the only sentence I'd carve into the mantle if I were the carving kind. He could have just asked me. I would have said yes to almost anything. That is what he and his mother built their entire plan around, and it is the one thing they never actually tried. I still live on Delaney Street. I put the tomatoes in that first spring, along the south fence, and hydrangeas where Vivian stood with her phone. They came in blue, which apparently has to do with the acid in the soil, and I've decided not to correct it. Harold Vance comes for lunch on the first Sunday of every month. He fixed the sticking window in the back bedroom in about 4 minutes with a chisel and a candle stub, and refused payment, and accepted a loaf of bread from my mother's recipe, which took me 9 tries, and which he ate 2 slices of in the car before he got out of the driveway, because I watched him from the porch. He took the intercom panel out himself, said he wanted to do it properly. Then he stood in my kitchen with the little board in his enormous scarred hands and said, "Rosalind would have liked you. She never trusted a quiet house." I asked him once why he called me instead of just deleting it all. It would have been so easy. Nobody would ever have known. He thought about it for a while. "Because I'd have known," he said, "and because you'd have signed it on a Friday and found out on a Tuesday 4 years from now, and by then there'd have been nothing left to save but your feelings." I do my dishes in the morning light. Some mornings I stand there longer than I need to, hands in the water, and I think about how close it came. Not the money. I'd have survived losing the money. What I nearly lost was the thing that took me 31 days and one old man's conscience to get back, the willingness to trust my own eyes over someone else's mouth. They had spent 11 years teaching me, gently, lovingly, with pot roast and coffee and a hand squeezed across a table, that what I saw with my own eyes was probably a misunderstanding. That's how it's always done, not with cruelty, with care. That's the whole trick. If a stranger had told me, on the day I signed for that house, that within a month I'd be recording my husband from the pocket of an old cardigan, I'd have said he had the wrong woman. He didn't. I just hadn't met her yet. I'd like to know what you would have done in that dining room. Would you have signed and said nothing and waited? Would you have thrown them out the day you heard the recording? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I read every one of them. If this story stayed with you, there are more of them here. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Take care of yourself, and read the fine print, even when it's handed to you by someone you love, especially then.